But if the Big Arb salesperson is seeing trees as these objects that I'm just using to make money with, that's sort of like an anti-nature stance.
Yeah.
They don't see trees as participants in their community. They see it as an object, not an organism. So we're going to be talking about the Big Arb problem.
Yeah, and not just strictly about the van, because I feel like we've beaten that kind of to death.
Yeah.
with a lot of our stuff.
And the van is really an important part of emphasizing one of the main points of this whole topic, and that is not needing all of this big stuff to actually take care of trees.
Yeah, and I think when we did the last one, I just kept thinking like, man, people are going to be sick of hearing about the van. I'm sick of hearing myself talk about it. I want to talk about something else.
Yeah.
But I think we brought up something that was kind of important that we thought, should probably highlight.
We originally wrote about this problem, I think back in 2019 or 2020. Since then, we've grown, we've practiced a lot more arboriculture and practiced more business. And I still think a lot of those main points are true.
Yeah.
But just realizing through all that, it's much more complicated than what we're about to talk about. I think what we're going to talk about now is just sort of scratching the surface of this topic. So to define it, I suppose, when we say Big Arb, we're not just talking about like the big juggernaut arboriculture companies. We're not just talking about Davey or Wright. They are included in that, but we're talking about all of the companies that emulate that business model and emulate all the practices therein. The equipment that they choose, the amount of personnel or employees that they rely on, the dogma that those companies believe in, all of that falls under the umbrella of what we call Big Arb.
Yeah.
That's what we're referring to. None of this is to say that this model is inherently bad.
Yeah.
But what we're getting at is that it has become the formula that 99% of tree companies use, and it's sort of now what everyone thinks tree companies need to look like in order to take care of trees.
Yeah.
And we argue that isn't the only way to do that.
Yeah. Overall, this isn't like a new concept, right? I mean, Alex Shigo sort of brought this whole idea to light like 30 years ago. And I think he said something like many tree treatments were like created to benefit the tree worker and not necessarily the tree.
Yeah. And he is by and large like considered someone who's sort of like a godfather of modern arboriculture.
Yeah.
And he himself has pointed this out 30 something years ago.
And then everyone just forgot about that. They like overlooked that.
Yeah.
But that's a big deal, you know?
Totally.
I mean, that's a big hole poked in
modern arboriculture.
like the industry of arboriculture.
Yeah. And I think that the problems that he was identifying back then are probably worse today than they were back then. And those problems are still around.
Well, yeah, I think because we have more information, more science than ever, but like still nothing's changed, right?
Yeah.
You know, like
the bottom line is that production has sort of overtaken arboriculture's real objective, which is taking care of trees. Production is now the North Star of a lot of the Big Arb companies.
Yeah, and despite us understanding more, like maybe when Alex Shigo said that, like our understanding of trees was here, industry was here, and now
the understanding's
way up here, and then we've gone like that.
Yeah,
you know, like they're not moving at the same like linear rate.
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying too that most industries are like that.
Yeah,
you know, but it seems that this one in particular is very slow to change.
You know, when I think about what Alex Shigo might have been referring to, it's kind of like American arboriculture has stayed in this sort of like, or they've fallen into this like bigger is better trap.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the place that he was coming from, is this sort of like
bigger, chipper, more people.
Yeah. Bigger trucks.
Bigger trucks. The dogma is still sort of the same.
Yeah.
You know, remove all the dead stuff, remove disease stems,
remove suckers.
And Alex Shigo wasn't saying these things, but he was making an observation that that's what the industry was doing.
Yeah.
And this sort of defies proper tree care.
Yeah.
None of that is improving the longevity of trees. Most of that is just lining the pockets of people who own tree businesses. It's good for the tree business owners, not so good for client outcomes and not so good for tree outcomes.
Companies, when they're first starting up, they see this model and like, this is what they emulate. And there's not really
Good point. Yeah. They'll emulate that even if they don't have the production demands or the clientele.
Yeah, or if they want to do something like more meaningful to them. You know, a lot of people go out on their own, flash forward 10 years, they're just like the company that they left.
You know, when we first started, Kevin had told us, be very careful with how you grow.
Yeah.
And back then we may not have known exactly what he was saying, but now more than ever, I know exactly what he meant.
Yeah. But like to that point of like scaling, right? The big Arb model sort of scales with width, right? You get more crews, you get more trucks, you get more equipment, more manpower.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what he was talking about, is like that becomes like a big monster that you have to sort of, you know, be able to rein in and like sort of herd.
Yeah. And with that perhaps comes some incentives that don't align with taking care of trees.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's this stereotype that the public has of our industry, that there's a lot of predatory selling tactics, which I would agree with.
Yeah, there are. Yeah.
I would agree with. But I don't think it's strictly a matter of maliciousness or being predatory. I think a lot of it is ignorance. I think a lot of arborists or tree cutters are not actually equipped to like diagnose and to think hard about a tree. They're not equipped for that. The roles that they have are in this business to make revenue.
Yeah.
You know?
And I think a big part of that is probably the low barrier of entry for people to get in. You know, you don't have to know a lot about trees to sell people on traditional tree work. You just have to know like what you heard the last guy say.
The Big Arb paradigm is optimized for revenue creation. While I understand that from like a numerical perspective, in that you want to spend the least amount of time and maximize your amount of revenue. Like I get all that.
Yeah.
But this comes at a cost to the environment, to the trees. Often it is to the detriment of the homeowner who thinks they're getting something good and beneficial. Yeah. They often don't know that they're paying for things that totally go against what the intention was.
Yeah. These, larger, Big Arb companies, sort of this paradigm we're talking about, it's optimized for like revenue creation, right? But at that, the other side of that coin is that the operational costs are high.
And I think that the ways that Big Arb companies operate, it's good for a lot of simple outcomes. Mm-hmm. You can cover a lot of ground, you have lots of crews, you have lots of equipment, lots of overhead, but the outcomes that happen as a result of that work are often very simple. Prune this or remove this, spray this or don't spray that.
Yeah.
The outcomes tend to be less nuanced.
Yeah, and I think to apply such simple measures to something as complex as a tree, like a biological organism, seems kind of silly,
Yeah. I think it's a strength to be able to have a wide reach with your outcomes. Like if you have a big contract, like a city contract, this model makes sense for that.
Mm-hmm.
But in a smaller scale, like for residential trees, that outfit or that model doesn't serve that need quite as well, because the production incentives that come with a big Arb company don't totally align with tree preservation. Clients often wrongfully think, and tree companies often wrongfully think also, that a lot of stuff on the ground means that a lot of work is being done.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that is true, but I'd argue if that work is good or not.
Yeah.
The notion of a good outcome or a bad outcome is probably something that we could make a whole separate video on, because that's, how do you measure that? That is something that is worth getting into the weeds about, because that's what you should be measuring your company's success with.
Yeah.
Not just client satisfaction and revenue, but also the arboricultural or environmental outcomes of your work.
Yeah. Are we doing a good job?
Yeah, actually.
Actually.
Yeah, yes, you can, have a successful work day.
Mm-hmm.
Everything went well, the rigging was cool, and the climbing, that's all fine. But how is nature after you leave it?
Yeah.
Is it actually better off, or is it actually worse off?
Yeah. And I think this is where the public suspicion of arborists kind of originates. People are kind of onto us about being salespeople and incentivizing and upselling and those types of sales tactics.
They should be.
Yeah, for sure. But this comes with sort of kind of what I talked about earlier. There's a low barrier to entry. Anyone can be a tree guy. If you hung out with Bob long enough on sales quotes, and you heard him say you have to remove suckers and prune that away from the house, and
you believe that stuff too.
Yeah, you believe that stuff too, and you can repeat that to somebody else, and then they've heard that from a bunch of other salesmen, so they're like, this guy knows what he's talking about.
Yeah, this aligns with what everyone else is saying. That must be the professional consensus.
In a lot of cases, there's not really many standards or licenses that we have to get as arborists. You can be a CA, right? And some states, I guess, do have a license to get.
Few states.
Few, very few and far between.
And to build on that, there's a lack of enforcement.
Yeah.
Just like you said, you don't have to. You can just say you're licensed and insured, and
no one's gonna
no one's checking that.
Yeah. What does that mean?
Yeah, and also no one's checking the trees that you're working on to see, were these cuts good?
Yeah.
Did you actually have to remove a third of this tree?
Mm-hmm.
Could you have just reduced this? No one's checking that.
And one of the things, that Dallas mentioned when we were at our last conference was, having a reason for every cut. Can you justify why you did what you did? A lot of times there's probably, not very much justification for the type of work that you've done.
I wanted to get out of here quicker.
Yeah.
So I took this whole thing off because I'm right here right now. I can make this cut right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. That is hugely problematic for the outcomes for trees.
For a number of reasons.
Even if you make a proper cut, it doesn't really matter. There's often this perception that so long as your cuts are properly executed, it is an okay thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
So there comes a point that, in your example you just outlined, where the tree people, the tree cutters, the arborist, whoever, start to believe the dogma that has
been perpetuated
to clients, to non-tree people, that you have to do all of these things to keep your trees healthy. I say this to point to the fact that, again, this isn't necessarily malicious. It comes from a place of ignorance that you have to do these things to your trees in order to keep your trees healthy.
Yeah.
And this is sort of where a feedback loop can begin, where arborist believes one thing, tells the client hears that from other sources as well, and then the client requests these things to be done to their trees.
And yeah, as a salesman going to look at a job, if they're already into and suggesting these things, you're like, oh, great sale. Like, I don't even have to sell you on anything. Like,
Yeah.
I'll just do it.
Right. And they believe that to be a good thing.
Yeah.
And they're not looking at, more nuance. They're looking at perhaps sales quotas, or they're aware of the company's overhead, or their job is strictly to sell things. And so this can be a point where a lot of misnomers about trees just get perpetuated.
Yeah.
This type of interaction has been happening for 30 plus years between arborists and their clients.
Yeah. And this kind of leads into like exploitation, not only of clients and the people that, we serve, but also exploitation of trees in general. We're taking advantage of them for our own like personal gain.
Yeah. And I think too that there's a lot of companies that perhaps don't even know that this conversation is talking about them. The combination of ignorance on tree biology and incentives that come from the Big Arb business model combine to bad outcomes across the board.
I think one of the challenges too is actually from the homeowner side or the people that are hiring out work, is that homeowners don't necessarily know how to vet like who's a good company and who's not. Because a lot of times on our websites we're saying that we care about trees, we love trees, your satisfaction is important to us. All this typical like
Default
stuff. It's all copy and pasted from website to website.
Yeah.
And when they all look the same, it's just kind of like throwing a dart. Like, oh well,
at a wall.
Yeah, at a wall. Yeah. And whoever has the best price, like that's what I'm going to go for.
Yeah.
Because they all say the same thing, or perhaps like brand themselves in the same way as each other. And as a homeowner,
how do you know?
Yeah, how are you supposed to know?
I think one of the ways that you can actually assess if an arborist is qualified is, in that conversation, is how much time they're actually willing to give you, or how receptive are they to answering your questions, or asking the client, what specifically are you asking for here?
Yeah.
And also, how much pushback are they going to give to the client? Sometimes, like in our interactions, not so much anymore, but early on when we had clients that would request things that were seemingly sort of outrageous, it was on us to actually correct them. Tell them what you're asking for is not actually in your best interest.
Yeah.
Yeah, we could have just accepted the job, taken the money, and it's not our problem anymore, but that's not what arborists actually do.
Yeah, or should do.
Yeah. So a metric that a homeowner could use perhaps is like, how engaged in the conversation is that person actually being?
Homeowners do try to do the right thing by hiring a certified arborist. And while that has some merit to it, I know plenty of certified arborists that do horrible work, and I know plenty of people that aren't certified arborists that do great work. So, the cat's kind of out of the bag on that, as far as like whether you're a certified arborist or not. It doesn't really
and that's
mean
also,
much.
Frankly, like it's an introductory cert.
Yeah.
It's not a rigorous thing that someone holds. It's something, sure, I grant that. But
I think everyone, should be, if you're going to work in the industry, at least,
at a minimum.
Yeah, at the minimum, you should be a certified arborist.
Yeah.
But
I think another way to measure a good arborist, and this is especially difficult, is that it's post-work. It's after the work is done. Where were the cuts made?
Yeah.
The placement of the cuts, how many of them, the distribution, but that relies on someone knowing what they're looking at in the first place.
Yeah. Does the work that's being carried out align with the conversation that you had? That's also probably a good a good way. If they're working a totally different side of the tree, that's probably not.
Or if they're talking about making the tree healthier, does that make sense that they're removing a bunch of stems needlessly?
Yeah.
Does that actually jive.
Yeah, some common sense, is...
Trees aren't very mystical.
Yeah.
A lot of it is very like basic biology stuff.
Yeah.
And basic physics stuff that once you know how to identify these things, I feel like you actually don't need to be a CA to be able to identify and explain why lion tailing isn't wise.
Yeah.
From a physics standpoint alone. There are standards, ANSI standards,
Best management.
Yeah, there's proper tree care is pretty established. Some of it isn't quite in line with where science is at, but by and large, the standards are actually pretty good. There are reasons to deviate from standards. That, though, should be reserved for people who really know what they're doing and can completely justify why they've done so. If we're looking at a huge removal cut, which is pick any tree on the street and you'll see huge removal cuts made on it, I don't think someone could present me with a very compelling argument on why I made this entire huge removal cut.
Yeah.
I could make a much better counter argument to why it was a bad idea.
Yeah, without seeing anything else, or like the tree in its original state.
Yeah. Things have to align perfectly to justify that, which almost never happens.
Yeah.
Here's a little anecdote that we can kick off this section with. That is, we have to acknowledge that bad practice is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Kind of. It's the standard. There have been times where I'm working with industry publications. They've requested me to sort of tone down my rhetoric about these kinds of things. And I pushed back and said, I don't want to perpetuate this false narrative that as an industry, that things are good. Things might be good for the business owners, but I'd argue on behalf of trees, things are very not good.
Yeah.
There are inarguably more good practitioners than there've ever been. But there are, I don't know, thousands of times more Big Arb companies that are not working for trees than there are good practitioners.
Yeah.
So I think that in order for any change to be had, or for the needle to start moving in the direction towards like responsible arboriculture, it has to start with thinking that this conversation applies to you.
Yeah.
It applies to everybody. By and large, our practice was made with very deliberate intention. And I think more companies, if any change is going to happen, they have to be far more deliberate in their own choice of equipping, how they employ staff, the measuring the outcomes of their work. All of that has to be done with deliberateness and not just by choosing the default settings.
Yeah. And I think one of the ways that we've sort of built our practice around or sort of modified our approach is just an emphasis on communication.
Yeah.
Right? Like we've said in our presentations before that a lot of arboriculture itself happens in conversation before any type of work actually takes place.
That the client expectations are well established. We're going to be pruning this tree to address risk. We're going to be working this area of the tree and this area of the tree only.
Yep.
This is the size, this is the diameter of the cuts that we're going to be making.
Yep.
This is why.
This is where the work's going to actually take place. We spend a lot of time and put a lot of focus on our client meetings and sort of educating them as to, what we feel is important when it comes to this tree. Are we going to address stress? Are we going to address risk?
We're not approaching client interactions as needing to get a sale.
Yeah.
It's first and foremost, what got your attention about your tree?
Yeah.
And giving the client license to ask us questions,
Yeah.
push back, or just have a very real conversation with me. And I think that we wear it quite proudly that I'm not a salesperson.
Yeah.
I'm here to talk to you and give suggestions about your tree.
One of the differences that I think our type of communication as practitioners is different from a Big Arb type of business is that, we're engaging in our community in sounds like a meaningful way. We're sort of giving back. We're doing the talks. We're meeting with garden groups. We're involved with the Nature Society. But a lot of times with these Big Arb sort of models, their way of communicating with the public is like door flyers and like the signs in people's yard. And it's just not human. It's not personal. It's not human, And I think that human element of communication is really important. Just that fostering like real relationships and not just advertising yourself. I guess this is a good way to put it. With your communication style as a practitioner or arborist, you should focus on creating relationships and not just advertising yourself, not trying to sell yourself.
Yeah. The way that I think a Big Arb salesperson interacts with trees is detrimental to the spirit that we're supposed to be promoting. Arborists are supposed to be promoting a good relationship with nature. Mm-hmm. But if the Big Arb salesperson is seeing trees as these objects that I'm just using to make money with, that's sort of like an anti-nature stance.
Yeah.
They don't see trees as participants in their community. They see it as an object, not an organism.
Yeah, and one of the ways you mentioned before is that you see trees as being not background, mm-hmm. right? And that, like, so to us and myself, like, very much so is like, trees are very real. Like, a lot of times they're like the last reminders in an urban place of like what is actually real. Mm-hmm.
And not artificial.
And I think a lot of times Big Arb sort of paints trees in a very just like object, fake sort of thing that I can manipulate to make money, and it's just kind of gross.
And it ends there.
Yeah.
It doesn't see it as, and their websites will say all the benefits of trees, but there's a huge difference between how they talk about trees and what the work actually looks like, and the outcomes of their work. They'll be the first to say on their websites, for example, trees can live 500 years old or whatever, but at early signs of being less than perfect, they're going to be condemning that tree.
So I have a question to pose to you. What would you say to the people that have sort of called our philosophy and the way we approach trees and the way we sort of operate as a business as being niche? Did I say that right?
I would say it's not a niche. I would say that being deliberate and professional is what would be the standard if arboriculture wasn't so unserious. I think anyone who takes the profession seriously would not call our business model niche. Yeah. I think they would call it precise. Generally, people, when they say that, they're saying it, they're not being like mean or rude or whatever, but they're saying that I can see this filling a small niche. And I don't think that it's small at all. I think what we've done is looked at the formula that's been the same formula for 30 years or more, and we've identified, hey, there's a whole bunch of shortcomings or inaccuracies in this formula. Mm-hmm. There's a whole bunch of issues with it. And this niche, I think, is really a need, as you put it, because what we're giving to the clients is good arboricultural outcomes. That's the most important metric that we're measuring success with. And so if someone were to say having good arboricultural outcomes is a niche, I would say like you're being foolish.
Yeah.
That's asinine. That's not, that should be the broader perspective.
Yeah.
That we're measuring our work quality with work quality.
Yeah.
Not with revenue, not with how big my knuckle boom is or anything like that.
Yeah.
Part of the way that the needle moves is by folks actually not using the default settings when they're building their companies. If all arborists, both ones that already have a business or ones that are just starting out, really take a close look at the formula that they're using, they should be doing that, because that's not only how you're going to figure out how to stand out amongst a very crowded space, but it's also going to, like you said earlier, it gives you guardrails to like prevent you from doing silly stuff with trees.
Yeah.
But that relies on you actually knowing what is actually good for trees and what is done to trees for money.
A business owner or an arborist's willingness to sort of step back and assess the formula that they have to be able to make this shift in the industry in a positive way.
Mm-hmm.
Did I say that? Did I say that
so.
right?
Yeah. And they have to be honest
with themselves
and with the outcomes of their work. And is it okay that all of the trees that I work on are worse off after I work on them? Is that okay?
Yeah.
If that is okay to you, then there's no change needed.
Yeah.
But if that is not okay, then
you should fix it.
Then you should fix it. And I acknowledge that that's not necessarily an easy answer, especially if you've built this big monster of a business that has to provide for 12, 15, 50 people.
Yeah.
I understand that those choices aren't easy, but arborists like hard things.
Yeah.
They sort of wear that on their sleeve. And so I don't think that because it's hard, we can't do it as an industry. I think that's exactly why it should be done, is that it's hard.
Yeah. And this change, on a grand scale is slow, right? But I think it's ultimately what is needed for trees now more than ever.
Totally. Yeah.
I mean, always. It was always needed. But
yeah.
We have the information now on how to do the right things. And we have the tools required to get those things done.
It is a conscious choice now at this point to not do those things.
Yeah.
Not knowing is not
It's not an acceptable answer.
It's not an acceptable answer because this information has been out.
And neither is not trying.
Yeah.
I think with a newer style approach to tree care that might not be as maybe proven as like the Big Arb model.
Yeah.
There's a hesitancy because frankly, it's not super optimized yet. There's a reluctance to want to move to that type of work because it's not optimized.
And that's probably where things are at currently.
Yeah.
That we've, as an industry, chosen to optimize on how fast can we remove this tree. Well, let's make a crane that has joints and a saw built into it.
Yeah.
And there's good reasons to do that stuff. But now Big Arb companies see that as like the pinnacle of arboricultural success. And our whole thesis has been, that's the wrong direction to be looking at.
Mm-hmm.
That's sure, trees sometimes need to be removed, but when everyone is maximizing for tree removal, no one gives a shit about tree care anymore.
Yeah. There's no trees to take care of anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. Optimizing for productivity and for, how fast we can kill trees with the biggest stuff. There hasn't been a lot of people working on optimizing preservation stuff.
Yeah.
It's like a skill tree in a video game. Everyone has put all their stat points into this, removal skill tree. And nearly no one is optimizing into the preservation side. And so we hope that our business model is sort of an example that people can follow, that like us, when we were working in a Big Arb setting, we thought like, this kind of sucks.
Yeah.
This doesn't feel good as someone who likes nature and who cares about trees. I don't like lying to people that I know what I'm doing is bad for your tree. And it didn't feel good to work in that setting for us. And so if there are other arborists who have those similar feelings, this is totally an option that they should explore. And I think for this model to become even further optimized, we need more
input.
There needs to be more input from other people trying it.
Yeah.
And we're definitely a resource for people interested in that. But having more of us is not only good for our own project, it's also just good for trees to have more people actively trying to optimize this business structure and actively trying to know as much about trees as physically possible.